we've got this article here. This is from Newsweek. So it says, how long can China survive Iran war with its saved up oil? Now, the context for this is that with the Strait of Hormuz closed, China doesn't have access to as much oil as they usually do, because China imports a lot of its oil from the Strait of Hormuz. So this is going to cause China to be more desperate, because as the Strait of Hormuz is closed, so is one of their biggest sources of oil. But let's read this article. This is published by Micah McCartney, their China news reporter. China repeated its push for the Strait of Hormuz to be reopened, issuing the joint message with America after U.S. President Donald Trump paid a visit to Beijing for meetings with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Trump went in looking for Beijing's influence on Iran, analysts believe, because China is close to Tehran and the buyer of more than 80% of its oil. Ooh. So China's oil imports has been decreased by 80% now. That's crazy. But China has its own reasons for wanting to keep the strait open, for supplies of oil and gas. While it buys most of Iran's oil, Iran is not its main supplier. China still sources from elsewhere. Okay. Critically, it has also built extensive reserves, in its response to the Strait crisis these past 11 weeks has shown just how prepared Beijing is for the energy shock for now. Yeah, and I did hear about that as well. People are like, oh, they're stockpiling oil, which was a surprise to me. I thought everyone stockpiled oil. The United States stockpiles oil. But yeah, I guess that's not something that they usually do. But despite China's considerable buffer, officials are getting impatient. The rising cost of crude globally is driving up transportation and logistics costs and tightening margins for manufacturing firms. Hormuz oil goes to Asia. We did discuss Iran. We feel very similarly about how we want that to end. We don't want them to have a nuclear weapon. We want the straits open, Trump told reporters following his meeting with Xi in Zhongnanhai, the leadership compound near Tiananmen Square that serves as headquarters for the Chinese Communist Party. Xi would also consider resuming imports of U.S. oil, Trump said, because of the Strait crisis. Chinese purchases of U.S. oil, which peaked at roughly 4% of China's total imports in 2020, were halted in May 2025 amid flaring trade tensions. The continent's top economies are particularly reliant on those sea lanes, with Japan sourcing nearly all its oil through the Strait of Hormuz, South Korea as much as 70%, and China and India roughly half of their oil inputs. China's foreign ministry on Friday urged the U.S. and Iran to hammer out a ceasefire and reopen the Strait of Hormuz, where commercial shipping has remained near a standstill since the Gulf conflict erupted earlier this year. Ministry spokesperson Guo Jiakun cited the severe losses suffered by the Iranian people in the countries across the region, as well as a heavy strain on global growth, energy security, and supply chains. While China has repeatedly condemned the U.S.-Israeli attacks as illegal, the country has also voiced displeasure with Iran's reprisals against vessels and oil infrastructure across the Gulf, and worked with Pakistan to bring Tehran to the negotiating table across from the U.S. Oh yeah, and that's normal too. By the way, I should add, it's very normal to be like, okay, this is a violation of international law. I think this is illegal or whatever, but I still don't want the enemies of that entity to succeed. Right, so just because you say, oh, these attacks on Iran were illegal, doesn't mean that you support the Iranian regime, right? So that's a fair thing to point out. China has so far rebuffed Trump's appeals for a more direct role, including potentially deploying naval vessels to safeguard shipping through the strait. Mikhail Maiden, head of China energy research at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies told Newsweek. China has not intervened diplomatically in the Middle East out of concern that it did not have enough leverage on all parties, that it would not be able to broker a deal, or that it could backfire given its extensive ties throughout the region. Adding to tensions are Washington's sanctions against several Chinese teapot refineries, a move last month to threaten secondary sanctions on banks doing business with them. That's interesting. Are these new sanctions? If these are new sanctions, these are a little escalatory. I'm not sure if I'm a fan of these because, to be honest, with the Strait of Hormuz closed, that enough is going to squeeze China over time. I understand wanting to accelerate China, feeling the heat, but if that is less direct, I think it's going to be a lot easier for China to accept. For example, I think that China is a lot more likely to be like, you know what? I think I'm cool with, stepping in here to take on Iran if they can look at the situation more objectively and sort of come away with the perspective of this is Iran's fault versus this is Iran and America's fault, because no one told Iran to close the Strait of Hormuz, right? But also no one told America to sanction these teapot refineries in banks, so I'm not a fan of that escalation. World's largest stockpile. Underpinning China's resilience is its aggressive stockpiling with an estimated 1.4 billion barrels of crude in its vast storage network, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. Okay, that's smart. That's enough to cover at least 3 months of import demand. Since building its first strategic reserve site in 2006, China has stepped up stockpiling with an eye toward energy security, drawing lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic and geopolitical volatility from crises such as such as Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. China stepped up its stockpiling in early 2025, even as fuel demand in the country was believed to be peaking, after introducing an energy law requiring both state-owned and private energy firms to maintain reserves. China's inventories of crude are fourfold the size of Japan's and more than 3 times the size of the United States Strategic Petroleum Reserve. The driving force behind this long-term trend is the Chinese government's strong emphasis on energy scrutiny, ensuring a crude oil supply, improving inventory regulation, and expanding inventory capacity remain priorities in China's next 5-year plan, said Melissa Tan, Director of Communications in Asia at S&P Global Commodity Insights. Even though China's oil demand is approaching its peak, the country remains highly dependent on imported crude, and total import volumes remain at elevated levels. The rapid increase in crude inventory levels in 2025 was also supported by weaker oil prices and storage capacity expansion, she told Newsweek. And that's very smart of them to have these massive stockpiles. I don't think America has stockpiles this robust. We should be doing what China is doing in this respect specifically. China accounted for less than 1/5 of the global increase in oil demand in 2024, down from more than 60% between 2013 and 2023, according to the International Energy Agency, which attributed the shift to China's transition from manufacturing-led to service-led growth and the rapid adoption of energy vehicles. Another factor was the global oil supply glut, driven by sluggish consumption growth in advanced economies, and the decision by OPEC Plus producers to raise output targets as the new production came online. China's high adoption of green energy, continued heavy coal use, and diversified oil supply sources further insulate the country. How long can China hold out? China's oil imports in April fell by 20% to 38.5 million metric tons, or 9.4 billion barrels per day, according to the country's General Administration of Customs, the lowest figure since July 2022. So this is one thing that's interesting. So if you went back and looked at how many barrels, they had how much? Oh yes. So they had an estimated 1.4 billion barrels of crude in its vast storage network. Okay. So if you want to understand the scale, right? 1.4 billion barrels of crude. However, they imported 38.5 million metric tons. No, sorry. So that's 9.4 million barrels per day, right? So they could hold out for some time, I think, if we're talking about not depleting your sources, right? So they're importing 9.4 million barrels. Wait, let me check this. 9.4 million barrels per day. So if we pull up a calculator, 9.4 million barrels per day for a month, that's 282 million barrels per day. They have in their stockpiles 1.4 billion barrels per day. So this means that in order for them to, let's say that they use up all of the oil in their reserves, let's just say they would need, they could only survive for maybe, let's say 3-4 months before they're out of oil, right? Because let's say they use everything from the crude resources from their stockpile. That's 1.4 billion. Yeah, I think that'd be like 4, maybe 5 months that they could survive this, and then they're going to be in a crisis mode. They'll probably be in a similar situation as Cuba. And that's not exaggerating. They would have to ration off the energy supplies. They have to do rolling blackouts. It would not be good. And this is why it's important to manufacture your own oil. And if possible, manufacture enough oil to be completely self-sustainable. This is why Donald Trump was running on this, is because having oil and being able to have enough oil to survive in case something like this happens is extremely important. Not a lot of people pay attention to this, though, because oil crises are not common. And so the current system of, we'll just trade all these people for oil has been working for the most part so far. But let's continue reading this. Bunny 234 in the chat says, this is insane, not gonna lie. Yeah, very true. Very true. This is insane. And it's not common. And this is a unique kind of pressure that Trump has over Iran, regardless of whether or not you agree with whether or not Trump should have gone into Iran or how Trump got into Iran. This is a unique kind of pressure that we have, unique leverage, right? I don't think America's had this much leverage over China for quite some time. This contraction was expected given the lag time for tankers departing the Persian Gulf on their weeks-long journey to China. S&P expects China to begin dipping into stockpiles this month. But the country is far from running dry. China is not at risk of running out of crude for many months. It's a question of cost and broader economic impacts, Maiden said. Yeah, see, that's kind of like estimates. Probably closer to 4 or 5 months, but yeah, it's going to take some months. So the supply shortfall is significant, but so is the ability to substitute parts of the loss. Even if the Strait of Hormuz was completely blocked, China can still source 60% of its oil from other suppliers outside the Middle East, including Russia's sanctioned crude. I see. Okay, that makes sense. Domestic demand is also relatively unique, so Chinese refiners have been cutting refinery runs. Oil prices jump in the Middle East war. Cost of Brent and WTI crude since February 1st. Now, this is interesting to watch as well, because markets do not respond positively to oil being greater than $100 for too long. Generally speaking, I believe most people in the oil industry kind of want oil to be sitting somewhere between like $70 to $80 and $100. If the cost is too low, then, well, if the cost is low, it's good, right? That signifies a surplus. So the cost of oil being too low is not historically something that we've had to worry about. When the cost is too high, that means that, some countries are not going to have enough energy to produce what they need, and that's going to hurt demand. So oil companies don't really like that. So we've seen oil kind of be around $99 to $100 pretty consistently here. We've seen some spikes that go up even up to like $118 here on March 31st. But in general, it's been at about $100, $105, $110. be interesting to see how long this lasts without major interventions from other countries. Europe has been running low to the point where I think they've had to decrease airplane travel, but they have not indicated that they want to get involved in the conflict. So I wonder what the pinpoint is going to be worldwide for crude oil prices, because typically the market has not been known to tolerate prices that high for that long. So China's supply losses, or the share of its crude imports likely to be cut off in disruption from Gulf volumes, excluding Iran, would amount to less than 20% of its total imports based on the 2025 average. Jianan Sun, senior oil analyst at Energy Aspects, told Newsweek. Oil sourced from the Middle East accounts for close to half of China's crude imports. While Chinese customs data does not officially record imports of Iranian oil because of U.S. sanctions, Iranian crude oil makes up about 13% of China's total imports, analytics firm Kepler estimates. So estimates seem to vary, right? I think it seems to go from like 15% to 30% of oil is estimated to come from Iran. To China. These shipments are largely delivered via the so-called shadow fleet and transferred through ship-to-ship operations before delivery to China's so-called teapot refineries. Largely in the northern province of Shandong, these independent refineries account for an estimated 25 to 30% of the country's total refining capacity, according to estimates by the Economist Intelligence Unit. Exporting fuel while others tighten their belts. While disruption, hold on, how long is this article? This is actually, oh yeah, we're almost done. While the disruption has forced Japan and South Korea to tap into their strategic reserves in Southeast Asian countries such as Vietnam and the Philippines to introduce fuel saving and fiscal measures to mitigate skyrocketing prices, China has faced less pressure to take drastic steps. This buffer has enabled Beijing to move more selectively to protect domestic fuel security, including ordering refiners to suspend fuel exports on March 12th. This might be an older article. While that initial, actually no, that's not an older article, it's just an older fact. While that initial move may have bruised some neighboring economies, China, Asia's fourth largest exporter of gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel, has since resumed exports of these three so-called clean fuels to countries including Australia, Malaysia, and Sri Lanka, signaling that officials assess domestic inventories to be stable. State energy companies this month are being allowed to export a total of 500,000 metric tons of fuel, or around 16,700 metric tons per day, Reuters reported, citing anonymous sources familiar with the matter. That is more than double the roughly 10,700 tons per day approved for April, though still well below the more than 53,000 tons per day average seen last year per Kepler. These efforts align with Chinese Foreign Ministry pledges to provide support amid shortages in the region. In addition to allowing Chinese state-run energy giants such as Sinopec to profit from higher international margins, the move also functions as a sign of goodwill to support regional economies, Martin said. China has less of a buffer in liquefied natural gas, with about 30% of its LNG imports coming from Qatar and Emirates, leaving it more exposed to disruption in Gulf shipping routes. So, what's the takeaway from this article? The takeaway should be that China can last probably up to maybe 5, if we're stretching it, maybe 6 more months without the oil from the Strait of Hormuz. So look for maybe somewhere between September and December at the very latest for things to change in these developments, because when China gets antsy, that's not going to make they're not going to make things very comfortable for the rest of the world. They either will step in or they will go against America upset that the Strait of Hormuz is not open. So kind of look for that. But for now, it does seem like China is safe. They are able to go off of their reserves as well as their remaining imports of other countries in order to get their energy for now.